We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The FBI has been tasked with building a framework to deal with unruly parents who question school boards. Mothers and fathers are furious at what they see as political indoctrination of the young. And with the Biden administration attempting to put billions of dollars into childcare and preschool programs, one wonders what ideological hoops providers may have to jump through. We're fortunate enough to be joined by Carrie Lucas, who's the managing director of Independent Women's Forum, IWF, and a prolific author. Now, Carrie has written a fantastic piece over at The Federalist that outlines precisely the threat faced by the educational encroachment. Now, she's here to help us unravel the risks and ramifications of this government push into the education sector. Welcome aboard, Carrie. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So, Carrie, what is the threat as you see it in terms of Joe Biden's multi-billion-dollar investment into schools?
Yeah, I think that everybody should be looking at this money. About $400 billion that they're dangling in front of parents that are supposed to subsidize childcare and daycare, and really wonder what are the strings that are going to come with this money, because we've seen in other sectors of the economy and certainly in the education system that with big funding comes big strings and basically big government control. And I don't think there's any reason to think that preschool and daycare will be any different.
Yeah, there's a case coming before the Supreme Court this term that looks at how faith-based schools, they've been excluded from certain funding programs. Now, that seems very much the carrot and the stick that you're discussing there. There's certain things that they have to do or would be required to do to achieve the funding. So how do you see the future of the faith schools going forward in this argument?
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because when you look at this, you've got this big debate going on about the quote human infrastructure bill, or these $3 trillion really social spending bills that's going on. And there aren't many details when it comes to a lot of the programs, and specifically with childcare. Basically, it says they'll be working with the states and handing out money with the intention of making it so all parents, not just poor parents, but get tremendous subsidies for their kids to attend, their kids under age 5, get to attend preschool and daycare. And they don't really say much about what the regulatory scope or how these plans would work. But if you dig just a little bit, if you go back into some of what the White House has written previously about their vision of a preschool program and a daycare program, you start realizing that this isn't going to be entirely hands-off. And some of the language they use, and I went kind of looking around, and they talk about the need to have, they talk about having qualified teachers in the schools. Well, that starts already, I'm thinking, like, who gets to decide what the daycare provider needs to be lectured in and what programs they need to have as their background. But then even more disturbingly, they talk about the types of curriculum, and all they say is something like behaviorally or developmentally appropriate. Okay, that sounds okay. And then they say inclusive. And I know from my own battles, I've got 5 kids in public school here, and I live in Virginia, 5 school-age kids, and I know that a lot of those things that sound perfectly fine, developmentally appropriate, inclusive, really are code words for doing really weird stuff in our public schools, including CRT and kind of this tremendous focus on race and really racial identity as something that kids should fixate on. And the developmentally appropriate is often things that as a parent, I think is really too early to introduce when it comes to sexuality issues and even gender identity. So I think parents should be looking at this and saying, if this is the only way for me to get subsidies is to go into a school that is going to do what they want on these issues, that means my choices are going to be pretty limited. And especially for some of the schools that say they don't want to do what they do, they're going to be going out of business.
Yeah, we've heard a lot of about CRT, critical race theory, in recent years, and there've been just as many denials that it's taking place as there have been stories about the tenets that it's teaching or that are reinforcing the education behind it. So what is the reality? Are these stories, are they out of proportion, or is there an effort to rename and reframe critical race theory so that parents can't really catch hold of the issue or understand the narrative?
Yeah, and I do think that it's one of those, it's almost become like a code word, and it doesn't always perfectly capture what we're talking about. I know I use it basically with this whole idea of the schools like fixating on race. And obviously, I think that you always need to kind of start this conversation with like, of course, I think we should be entirely inclusive. We should teach about the history of America and our troubled past with slavery and with racism. Those are all very legitimate topics. But what we're talking about, and I see this on the public schools, is that we're not talking about that. We're not talking about like an honest evaluation of kind of our American journey or the journey of the Western world in terms of our improvements in race relations. What they're focused on is talking about how today, basically racism is the fundamental the structure under which everything should be understood. And the thing that I find most disturbing, and especially when I think about how this could morph down to preschool, is thinking about how to think about yourself. And about your role and really your responsibilities, because my kids are all white, and I don't want them to grow up thinking that means that they're bad, that they're different, that they have to almost worry about how they interact with kids of other colors, white or whatever. Like that, this shouldn't be the defining thing that they should be thinking about. And I do worry that that's what's happening in K through 12 today. And that's how it will come. And they're not going to start, with like serious texts about critical race theory or whatever. But this mentality, this race first, will definitely infect preschools and daycare centers if the government is put in charge.
Yes, it seems that it's the idea of putting one group as the oppressed and one group as the oppressor, literally based on their skin color. But of course, we have seen talk of the oppressed and the oppressor before. I believe it was it Karl Marx?
There you go.
I think
Absolutely.
it was.
Yeah.
How strange. What a coincidence. So what areas of teaching does this, let's call it backdoor or code word indoctrination, impact? I mean, is it just certain courses or curricula, or is it spread wider and inherent in each curricula?
I think that it is increasingly, it's the starting place for education, and increasingly in America. And certainly I think that's the thing that worries me about preschools, that it does become like a frame that everything is discussed through. And I don't think that's what parents want. And the main thing, it's interesting, because one thing I think that when we have these conversations where the left wants to say, that we're on the side, or that the people who are opposing this, that we want to like shut down conversations. And I don't. I think that parents, and that's why I don't support outlawing critical race theory. I think that I just want parents to have choice. And the problem with a program like what we're going to see, if the federal government becomes involved in daycare, and they become the one who is able to certify daycare centers and where you're allowed to go and receive these subsidies, suddenly that becomes the default choice, as it is with public school. Obviously with public schools in America, I could, if I had a ton of money, I would then shop around and send my kids to pay for the tuitions, $20,000 in many cases for high school tuition here in the United States. But if you can't afford that, that you end up at whatever it is that the government serves up. And that's how it's going to be in preschool. If you want these government subsidies, you will be in a government sanctioned preschool. And just to play off your Karl Marx thing, because it's easy to kind of, we're being so ridiculous, that's way over the top. I do think that people should be aware, it's not just Marx. It's not just the whole Nazi Hitler youth thing. We see this around the world today. We see this in China. We've seen it in Venezuela. You see how governments know that teaching what is taught is central to the future of the country. And I do think as Americans, in the same way, I think there's a lot of people on the left who would say, gosh, I don't want whatever they see as the crazy boogeyman on the right. They shouldn't want them making curriculum decisions. Well, I don't want them making curriculum decisions. So we don't need to argue about this. We can say, get government out of our schools and our education system, and certainly don't get them in to teaching my preschoolers.
Yeah, I think this issue has really come to light during the COVID shutdowns and pandemic. Well, the shutdown specifically. I mean, a lot of parents were quite shocked to find out what was going on in their kids' classrooms, what was being taught, when they could actually see it via the Zoom teaching sessions, as it were. The lockdown provided a very rare glimpse into the classroom. In essence, it allowed them to see behind the curtain, and they weren't happy. Now, you wrote in the article that you put up on the Federalist that the lack of in-person schooling can be highly damaging, especially to special needs kids from low-income backgrounds. But isn't it also true that it's now become a balancing act of concern for parents? I mean, they have to weigh up the indoctrination versus the benefits of in-person schooling, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I do think you're absolutely right. If you think about the silver lining of COVID, and I found at home school or doing virtual school was I thought it was a disaster. I know I don't want to speak anecdotally, but I did have 5 kids who were logging on, and it was incredibly mind-numbing. You think as a parent, I'd always been really focused on trying to limit my kids' time spent on screens because I do want them to have that fundamental learn how to interact with other people, especially kids their age, and they lacked that. But you're right that we did see all of a sudden that the teachers I trusted to just be interested in teaching my kids kind of those core skills and to be good citizens and to kind of provide that framework for education, that often they do have a different agenda. And it was very surprising to me to see what was being served up. Not all, some of this kids' teachers were great, but some were obviously had a different agenda. And what we see now, you're right, a lot of parents are now taking their kids out of school and finding new solutions. I just think the important thing is that parents should have more control, it shouldn't be an all or nothing. I'm either, going to homeschool my kid and have them in my house and be in charge of them, or send them to a school where there is going to be this leftist and really fundamentally, I think, racially charged, even, I think it's fairly racist, a lot of what's being taught now. We shouldn't be left with that. We can do better. Parents should have more leverage and more say and more options.
Well, let's talk about those options briefly. So final question, if I may, Carrie. Now, we love to find solutions here on Liberty Nation Radio rather than just repeating the litany of miseries, which are unfortunately so often here. But what is the solution?
Yeah, and I'm a big believer that money should follow parents, and I do think it's interesting as a conservative and as somebody who often questions government's role in our lives. It doesn't mean that I don't think that the government shouldn't help some parents who are really struggling with childcare costs. A lot of times daycare can be very expensive, and we should be targeting help, support, tax credits and whatnot to help parents who do need support, but they should control that. And it shouldn't be the government who gets to decide what childcare situation. Frankly, it shouldn't be the government that says you have to send that child to an official institutional daycare. If grandma can do it, if the nice lady down the street has 2 kids and is willing, we should find ways and really encourage civil society to provide good ways to support kids. And the good news is when it comes to the education field in particular, K through 12 education, we do see this loosening because so many parents were so disgusted, so motivated, that we see that the grip is loosening a little bit. You have many more people starting to homeschool and finding hybrid homeschools so that they have pods and are working with other parents so kids do have that social interaction, and a growing number of private schools. I know a lot of parents who are similar like me, wow, it would really hurt to have to pay for tuition, who said, forget it, this is too important, and are making enormous financial sacrifices, forgoing vacations, taking out second mortgages so that they can make sure that their kids are in a school that reflects their values. So the battle is out there, and I think the good news is that parents, don't let them call you terrorists. Speak up, because we can change this. We are the majority, not them.
Carrie Lucas, thank you ever so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me on.
And that's about it for this episode of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I want to thank all of our guests, Andrew Moran, Editor-in-Chief of Liberty Nation, Lisa K. Donner, and Scott Cosenza on our Talking Liberty segment, and for our first-time visitor, Carrie Lucas of the Independent Women's Forum. But most of all, you, the faithful listener, I want to thank you for being here and being part of Team Liberty. I'll leave you with one final thought. Thomas Paine once wrote in one of his letters, "The mind, once enlightened, cannot again become dark." And this, for me, is at the heart of what's happening in schools across the world. There's a push to indoctrinate, not educate. And by doing so, we keep children forever wrapped in a dark cloak of ignorance. They believe that they know all, when really they understand nothing. And this can only be a detriment to them. It's the role of all of us, you and I, everybody, to bring about the enlightenment that they need. The future will never forgive us for leaving them in this dark, dark place. So there is hope. And it comes from you and I, as always. Until next time, thank you for listening. Liberty Nation Radio. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Who are we? We are Americans that believe in liberty. We are a project of the nonprofit One Generation Away. We are patriots who apply the founding principles to the issues of today.
And they keep moving the goalposts on us.
We are educators and commentators who love America and the Constitution. Who are we? We are Liberty Nation.